The streets are quiet now. The neighborhoods that once echoed with gunfire have changed. Luxury condominiums stand where abandoned buildings once overlooked the violence. Palm trees sway along the roads of South Florida, hiding scars that are easy to miss unless you know where to look. For many, the bloodshed of the late 1970s and early 1980s has become another chapter in history. But for the detectives who worked those cases, the journalists who reported them, and the families who never saw loved ones return home, the memories have never truly disappeared. At the center of that era was a woman whose name inspired fear across 2 countries, Griselda Blanco. To some, she was known simply as the Godmother of Cocaine. Others called her the Black Widow, a nickname earned through allegations that several of her husbands and close associates died under violent circumstances during her rise to power. Long before the world's attention focused on the Medellin Cartel and the global notoriety of Pablo Escobar, Griselda Blanco had already built one of the most profitable cocaine trafficking operations the United States had ever seen. Investigators would later estimate that her organization moved hundreds of kilograms of cocaine every month into the United States, generating enormous profits during the rapid expansion of the cocaine trade. Federal authorities believed her network stretched from Colombia to New York, California, and eventually South Florida, where competition between trafficking organizations fueled an unprecedented wave of violence. Her business was built on secrecy, loyalty, intimidation, and a willingness to use deadly force. Law enforcement agencies would eventually connect her criminal organization to dozens of murders, although the exact number remains uncertain. Some accounts have claimed she ordered hundreds of killings, but historians and investigators caution that many of those figures were never conclusively proven in court. What remains undisputed is that her organization played a significant role in one of the most violent periods in American drug trafficking history. Her methods were often calculated: drive-by shootings, contract killings, public executions designed to send unmistakable messages. Investigators also linked members of her organization to the use of motorcycle-riding gunmen, an assassination tactic that would later become associated with organized crime in Colombia. Whether she pioneered the method or helped popularize it remains debated, but authorities repeatedly encountered it during investigations connected to her network. Every act of violence served a purpose: a rival eliminated, a debt collected, a witness silenced. Fear itself became another weapon in her expanding empire. As profits grew, so did the attention of federal agents, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, local police departments from New York to Miami. Each agency was chasing fragments of a criminal enterprise that constantly changed names, locations, and participants. By the time investigators connected one shipment to another, millions of dollars had already crossed international borders. For years, Griselda Blanco seemed to stay one step ahead. She changed identities, she relocated cities, she relied on trusted family members and loyal associates. When pressure increased in one place, the organization simply adapted somewhere else. Yet power built through violence rarely lasts. As the cocaine trade expanded, so did betrayal. Former allies became informants, partners became rivals, trusted lieutenants disappeared. The empire that had seemed untouchable slowly began to fracture under the combined weight of relentless investigations, internal conflict, and the same violence that had fueled its rise. But to understand how one woman became one of the most feared figures in the history of international drug trafficking, we have to return to the beginning, not to the mansions, not to the millions of dollars, not to the headlines, but to the streets of Colombia, where poverty, instability, and survival shaped a young girl whose life would become inseparable from the global cocaine trade. This is the story of Griselda Blanco, a story built not on legend but on documented investigations, court records, witness testimony, and the lasting consequences of an empire that changed organized crime in the Americas. This is the rise and the fall of the woman history remembers as the Godmother of Cocaine. The story of Griselda Blanco does not begin with cocaine, it begins in poverty. Before she became one of the most feared figures in organized crime, Before investigators connected her name to an international drug empire, Griselda Blanco was simply another child growing up in a country struggling with inequality, political instability, and violence. She was born on February 15, 1943 in Cartagena, Colombia. Her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, was a single parent who worked hard to support her family. When Griselda was still very young, they left the Caribbean coast and moved hundreds of miles inland to Medellin, a city that would later become synonymous with the global cocaine trade. But in the 1940s and 1950s, Medellin was a city in transition. Factories and textile mills attracted thousands of families hoping to escape rural poverty. Entire neighborhoods expanded almost overnight. Many newcomers found work, but many more struggled to survive. The city's poorest districts became crowded with makeshift homes built on steep hillsides. Running water was limited, electricity was unreliable, jobs were scarce. For children growing up there, opportunities were few. Crime often became part of everyday life: petty theft, street gangs, smuggling. Violence was not unusual, it was woven into daily existence. Griselda spent much of her childhood in these difficult surroundings. Accounts of her early life vary, and some stories have become difficult to verify over time. One of the most repeated claims is that at the age of 11, she participated in the kidnapping of a young boy from an affluent family, and that the child was later killed when a ransom was not paid. The story has appeared in numerous books and media reports, helping shape Blanco's fearsome reputation. However, no contemporary court records or police documents have conclusively confirmed the incident. As with many stories surrounding Griselda Blanco, the line between documented fact and criminal folklore is often blurred. What is better established is that she became involved in criminal activity at a young age. Former associates and investigators have described her adolescence as one marked by theft, pickpocketing, and surviving through illegal means. In neighborhoods where poverty was widespread, many young people learned quickly that crime could offer immediate rewards unavailable through honest work. For Griselda, survival appears to have become inseparable from criminality. Those who later studied her life often noted that she grew up during one of Colombia's most turbulent periods. Beginning in 1948, following the assassination of presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, Colombia entered a decade of political violence known as La Violencia. Although much of the fighting occurred in rural areas, its effects reached cities across the country. Families fled conflict, communities fractured, weapons became more common, violence became normalized, an entire generation grew up surrounded by instability. While historians are careful not to attribute individual crimes solely to social conditions, the environment in which Griselda Blanco was raised undoubtedly exposed her to hardship, insecurity, and violence from an early age. As she entered her teenage years, her relationship with her mother reportedly deteriorated. Some accounts suggest she left home while still an adolescent. Without stable housing or regular employment, she spent much of her youth navigating Medellin's criminal underworld. She learned who controlled different neighborhoods. She learned how stolen goods were sold. She learned that trust was often temporary and betrayal could come without warning. These were lessons that would later define the way she built her own criminal organization. Unlike many future cartel leaders, Griselda Blanco did not begin her career through large-scale drug trafficking. Her first known criminal activities centered on theft, document fraud, and small-scale illicit enterprises. According to investigators who later examined her history, she developed a remarkable ability to observe people. She remembered faces, she noticed routines, she identified weaknesses. Those skills would eventually become valuable in organizing criminal operations, avoiding law enforcement, and identifying potential threats. During her teenage years, she also entered into relationships that introduced her to increasingly sophisticated criminal networks. One of the most significant was with Carlos Trujillo, whom she married while still very young. Together, they had children and became involved in criminal activity, including the use of forged identification documents and various forms of illicit trade. These early ventures did not generate enormous wealth, but they taught valuable lessons: how to move illegally obtained goods, how to recruit trusted associates, how to avoid attracting police attention, how to operate within informal criminal networks that stretched across neighborhoods and eventually across borders. By the early 1960s, Colombia itself was changing. Demand for narcotics in the United States was beginning to grow. Smuggling routes that had once been used primarily for contraband goods were slowly adapting to a far more profitable product: cocaine. At the time, cocaine trafficking was still relatively small compared to what it would become in the following decades. Few could have imagined that the drug would soon reshape economies, governments, law enforcement agencies, and organized crime throughout the Americas. Fewer still could have predicted that one woman from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods would become one of its earliest and most influential traffickers. For Griselda Blanco, poverty had already taught one lesson that would remain constant throughout her life. Power belonged to those willing to take risks, and as new opportunities emerged within Colombia's growing criminal underworld, she was preparing to take the greatest risk of all. The streets of Medellin had shaped her. By the early 1960s, Griselda Blanco was no longer simply surviving on the streets of Medellin. She was becoming part of a growing criminal underworld. The transformation did not happen overnight. There was no single moment that marked her entry into organized crime. Instead, it was a gradual progression, one illegal opportunity leading to another, each carrying greater risks and greater rewards. Colombia was changing rapidly. Urban migration continued to swell the population of cities like Medellin. Poverty remained widespread, while legitimate employment failed to keep pace. Across the country, black markets flourished. Smuggling, document forgery, stolen goods, and contraband became profitable businesses for those willing to operate outside the law. Griselda quickly learned that crime was no longer just a means of survival, it could become a profession. According to investigators and later court testimony, Blanco became involved in forged documents, stolen merchandise, and small-scale smuggling operations. These activities demanded organization rather than brute force. They required trusted contacts, safe houses, transportation routes, and the ability to stay one step ahead of the police. It was during this period that she met Carlos Trujillo. The two eventually married and had children together. Trujillo was also involved in criminal activity, and together they navigated Colombia's expanding illicit economy. Their partnership exposed Griselda to broader criminal networks, introducing her to experienced smugglers and brokers who operated beyond Medellin. The couple's ambitions soon extended beyond Colombia. During the 1960s, many Colombian criminals recognized an opportunity in the United States. Large immigrant communities in cities such as New York provided both anonymity and access to lucrative underground markets. For Griselda, America represented more than a destination. It represented possibility. She eventually relocated to New York, where Colombian criminal groups were beginning to establish trafficking routes. At first, cocaine was not yet the dominant product it would become. Smuggling operations often involved counterfeit documents, stolen property, and other forms of contraband. But cocaine was gaining value. Demand in the United States was steadily increasing, while law enforcement had not yet developed the specialized strategies that would later target international drug cartels. Blanco recognized the opportunity early. Former investigators would later describe her as highly observant and exceptionally patient. Rather than rushing into large operations, she studied how shipments moved, how distributors worked, and where security was weakest. She watched, she learned, and she adapted. But business was only one side of her reputation. The other was violence. Stories about Griselda Blanco's first killings have circulated for decades, but separating fact from legend is difficult. Numerous books and documentaries describe violent confrontations involving Blanco during the 1960s. Some accounts claim she personally carried out murders. Others suggest she ordered associates to eliminate rivals or perceived threats. Many of these stories cannot be independently verified through surviving court records. What is firmly established, however, is that by the early 1970s, law enforcement agencies regarded her organization as one that used violence to protect its operations. Witnesses and cooperating defendants consistently described intimidation, retaliation, and murder as tools employed against rivals, debtors, and suspected informants. Violence was not random, it served a purpose. Every criminal organization depends on reputation. A reputation for reliability attracts business. A reputation for ruthlessness discourages betrayal. Investigators later concluded that Blanco understood this principle exceptionally well. Former associates testified that disobedience was rarely tolerated. Employees who stole money, distributors who failed to pay debts, or competitors who threatened her interests often faced swift consequences. Whether every allegation was true mattered less than the reputation itself. Fear became one of her most valuable assets. By the late 1960s, Blanco was no longer a low-level criminal. She had begun assembling a network built on loyalty, family ties, and carefully selected associates. She preferred working with people she believed she could control. Relatives, trusted friends, and longtime acquaintances often occupied key positions within her growing enterprise. It was a structure that reduced the risk of infiltration while strengthening personal loyalty, but it also made betrayal deeply personal. Around this time, her marriage to Carlos Trujillo began to unravel. Accounts differ regarding the precise reasons. The pressures of criminal life, growing ambitions, and internal conflicts all appear to have played a role. Their relationship eventually ended, and Trujillo was later killed in Colombia. His death has frequently been linked to Blanco in books and media reports, contributing to her later nickname, the Black Widow. However, no court ever convicted her of arranging his murder, and the circumstances remain disputed. The uncertainty surrounding Trujillo's death would become a recurring theme throughout Blanco's life. Many violent incidents were attributed to her. Some were supported by witness testimony. Others rested largely on rumor, hearsay, or the statements of criminals seeking reduced sentences. Investigators often suspected her involvement, even when evidence was insufficient for prosecution. That combination of documented violence and persistent legend made Griselda Blanco one of the most enigmatic figures in organized crime. As the years passed, another pattern emerged. Blanco was not content to remain a participant in someone else's operation. She wanted control. Control over shipments, control over profits, control over the people who worked for her. Unlike many traffickers who relied on established criminal organizations, Blanco increasingly built her own network from the ground up. She recruited couriers, distributors, transport specialists, and enforcers. She emphasized secrecy, compartmentalization, and strict discipline. If one member of the organization was arrested, they knew little about the others. It was a system that made investigations far more difficult. Federal agents would later spend years piecing together fragments of her operation, often relying on multiple informants before understanding its full scope. At the same time, cocaine itself was becoming dramatically more profitable. Advances in production and trafficking allowed Colombian suppliers to move larger quantities into North America than ever before. What had once been a niche market was evolving into an international business worth millions of dollars. Griselda Blanco saw the future before many of her competitors. She understood that the greatest fortunes would not be made through theft or forgery, they would be made through cocaine. The skills she had developed over years of survival, building trusted networks, avoiding police scrutiny, using intimidation, and maintaining absolute control, would soon be applied to an entirely different enterprise. One that would transform her from a neighborhood criminal into one of the most powerful drug traffickers of her generation. The world knew little about Griselda Blanco, but that was about to change. As cocaine flooded into the United States during the 1970s, she would seize an opportunity that few others recognized and build an empire whose violence would leave an enduring mark on both Colombia and America. By the early 1970s, cocaine was no longer a rare luxury. What had once circulated quietly among wealthy social circles was becoming a rapidly expanding commodity. In the United States, demand was rising year after year. Buyers were willing to pay extraordinary prices, and suppliers in Colombia realized they were sitting at the beginning of an industry that would soon be worth billions of dollars. For Griselda Blanco, the opportunity was impossible to ignore. Unlike many traffickers who entered the cocaine business after it had already become profitable, Blanco was among those who recognized its potential in its earliest stages. While larger criminal organizations were still developing, she was already building the foundations of a sophisticated trafficking network. Her base of operations shifted increasingly toward New York City. The city's large population, busy ports, and international airports made it an ideal entry point for narcotics arriving from South America. Colombian immigrant communities also provided a degree of anonymity, allowing traffickers to blend into neighborhoods where newcomers arrived every day. But moving cocaine into the United States was only the first challenge. Keeping it moving without attracting law enforcement required careful planning. According to investigators, Blanco paid close attention to logistics. Every shipment involved multiple people, each with a limited role. Couriers often knew little about suppliers, drivers rarely knew final destinations. Money moved separately from the drugs themselves. If one link in the chain failed, the rest of the organization could continue operating. It was a structure that would later become common among international trafficking organizations. During this period, Blanco also gained a reputation for innovation. One of the most frequently documented examples involved specially designed undergarments with concealed compartments. Working with clothing manufacturers, members of her organization allegedly created bras and girdles capable of hiding small quantities of cocaine. Female couriers wore the garments on commercial flights between Colombia and the United States, reducing the likelihood of detection. While the quantities carried by each courier were relatively modest, the system relied on volume. One courier might attract attention. 20 couriers traveling separately often did not. The strategy reflected Blanco's approach to organized crime. Success depended not on one spectacular shipment, but on a constant flow of smaller, carefully managed deliveries. As profits increased, so did her influence. Former associates described Blanco as deeply involved in every aspect of the operation. She reportedly approved major business decisions personally, negotiated prices, selected trusted distributors, and monitored debts with remarkable attention to detail. Money was carefully tracked. Mistakes were not easily forgiven. Her leadership style combined business discipline with intimidation. Employees who proved reliable could earn substantial sums. Those suspected of dishonesty risked immediate punishment. This combination of financial incentive and fear created an organization that was both productive and difficult to infiltrate. Law enforcement agencies, however, were beginning to notice unusual patterns. The Drug Enforcement Administration, established in 1973, intensified efforts to combat international narcotics trafficking. Federal agents observed growing quantities of cocaine entering major American cities, but identifying those responsible proved difficult. Traffickers rarely used their real names. Companies existed only on paper. Apartments served as temporary storage sites before shipments disappeared into local distribution networks. By the time investigators traced one operation, another had already replaced it. Griselda Blanco thrived in this environment. She understood that anonymity could be more valuable than publicity. Unlike some later drug traffickers who cultivated public images of wealth and influence, Blanco generally preferred operating from the shadows. Her organization expanded while her name remained largely unknown outside law enforcement circles. At the same time, her personal life became increasingly complicated. After the end of her marriage to Carlos Trujillo, Blanco entered another relationship with Alberto Bravo, a trafficker who shared her ambitions. Together, they expanded cocaine smuggling operations, moving larger quantities into the United States and generating enormous profits. For several years, the partnership proved highly successful. Money flowed rapidly, properties were purchased, new contacts were established throughout Colombia and North America. Their network expanded beyond New York, reaching distribution points in California, Florida, and other major cities. But success created new tensions. In criminal enterprises, trust is often measured in money, and as profits multiplied, suspicion followed. According to later accounts from investigators and former associates, Blanco eventually became convinced that Bravo had been withholding millions of dollars from their business. The disagreement escalated dramatically. One of the most widely reported incidents occurred in Bogotá in the mid-1970s. According to multiple law enforcement accounts, Blanco confronted Bravo in the parking lot of a nightclub. The meeting quickly erupted into a gunfight involving both sides. Several people were wounded. Alberto Bravo was killed. Blanco herself reportedly survived despite being shot. Although different witnesses offered varying versions of the confrontation, investigators generally accepted that the partnership had ended in deadly violence. The incident reinforced an image that would follow Blanco for the rest of her life. Business disputes around her often ended with bloodshed. Whether dealing with rivals, employees, or even close associates, violence appeared to be an accepted method of resolving conflict. By the late 1970s, Blanco stood at the head of one of the most profitable cocaine trafficking organizations operating between Colombia and the United States. Federal investigators later estimated that her network generated millions of dollars each month, moving cocaine through an increasingly sophisticated web of suppliers, couriers, wholesalers, and street-level distributors. Her wealth became extraordinary: luxury homes, expensive automobiles, designer clothing, cash stored in multiple locations. Yet despite the money, she remained intensely focused on expanding her organization. Every new city represented another market. Every successful shipment funded the next. Every competitor became either a potential partner or an obstacle. It was also during this period that Blanco strengthened her ties to influential figures within Colombia's emerging cocaine industry. Although she operated independently, she maintained relationships with suppliers and traffickers who would later become central figures in what became known as the Medellin Cartel. At this stage, however, the loose network of traffickers had not yet evolved into the highly structured organization that would dominate the global cocaine trade in the following decade. Blanco had arrived early. She was helping establish the very routes, methods, and business practices that others would later adopt on a much larger scale. Federal agents were beginning to understand that they were no longer investigating isolated smugglers. They were confronting an international criminal enterprise, an enterprise with enormous financial resources, an enterprise protected by violence, an enterprise led in large part by a woman whose name most Americans had never heard. That anonymity would not last. As Blanco expanded into South Florida, she entered one of the most competitive and violent drug markets in American history. By the late 1970s, the center of America's cocaine trade was shifting. For years, New York had served as one of the primary gateways for Colombian traffickers, but another city was becoming far more attractive: Miami. Its geography made it almost impossible to ignore. Sitting just a short distance from the Caribbean, South Florida offered quick access by sea and air. Thousands of boats crossed its waters every week. Commercial flights arrived daily from Latin America. The city's rapidly growing population, booming nightlife, and expanding financial sector created an ideal environment for laundering enormous amounts of money. To traffickers, Miami wasn't simply another market, it was the future. As law enforcement pressure increased in New York, Griselda Blanco saw an opportunity to relocate much of her operation. During the late 1970s, she moved her organization to South Florida, bringing with her trusted associates, experienced distributors, and a business model that had already proven highly successful. What she found was a city on the verge of chaos. Cocaine consumption in the United States had reached unprecedented levels. Demand seemed limitless. Every successful shipment generated millions of dollars in profit, and new traffickers appeared almost weekly, eager to claim a share of the market. There were no established rules, no central authority, no single cartel controlled Miami. Instead, dozens of independent organizations competed for territory, customers, and smuggling routes. The result was an explosion of violence. Journalists would later describe this period as the era of the cocaine cowboys. It was a time when drug traffickers displayed extraordinary wealth while openly carrying military-style weapons. Luxury sports cars filled hotel parking lots. Nightclubs became meeting places for traffickers, money brokers, and smugglers. Cash flowed through restaurants, real estate, and legitimate businesses at astonishing speed. But beneath the glamour lay relentless bloodshed. Disputes that might once have ended in negotiation increasingly ended in murder. Contract killings became common. Bodies appeared in parking lots, vacant fields, and apartment complexes. Shootings occurred in broad daylight, sometimes in front of shoppers and tourists. The violence reached such levels that national newspapers began reporting on Miami almost daily. Against this backdrop, Griselda Blanco expanded her influence. Unlike many competitors, she did not rely solely on intimidation through reputation. She invested heavily in organization. Her distribution network extended across multiple states. Shipments arrived through a variety of routes. Safe houses were constantly changed. Money moved through trusted couriers and shell businesses. Federal investigators later described her organization as disciplined, compartmentalized, and remarkably resilient. If one shipment was seized, another was already on its way. If one distributor was arrested, another immediately filled the position. Every part of the operation had a backup. Every backup had another waiting behind it. But efficiency alone could not protect a criminal empire operating in Miami. Competition was fierce. Traffickers fought over wholesale prices. They competed for distributors. They recruited each other's employees. In this environment, loyalty became increasingly fragile. According to investigators and court testimony, Blanco responded to threats with extraordinary speed. Those suspected of stealing from her organization risked violent retaliation. Rivals who interfered with shipments often disappeared. Witnesses later described an atmosphere in which fear became as valuable as money. If word spread that betrayal would be met with deadly consequences, fewer people were willing to take the risk. Law enforcement agencies began noticing recurring patterns. Different murder scenes involved individuals connected to the cocaine trade. Victims often had ties to Colombian trafficking organizations. Witnesses were reluctant to cooperate. Those who did frequently withdrew their statements. Fear of retaliation reached far beyond the criminal world. Police officers, prosecutors, and judges understood they were confronting organizations willing to use violence to protect their business. One incident became symbolic of the era. On July 11, 1979, gunmen entered the Dadeland Mall shopping center in suburban Miami and opened fire inside a liquor store, killing 2 men and wounding others. Although the attack was linked to rival traffickers rather than directly attributed to Blanco, it shocked the public. The idea that heavily armed gunmen would carry out executions inside a busy shopping mall demonstrated how emboldened drug organizations had become. For many Americans, Miami no longer resembled a vacation destination, it resembled a battlefield. The violence prompted major changes in law enforcement. Federal agencies increased their presence in South Florida. Special task forces were established. Investigators from local police departments, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Customs Service, and other agencies began sharing intelligence more closely than ever before. Still, the investigations moved slowly. Traffickers used false identities. Cash transactions left few records. Witnesses often refused to testify. Successful prosecutions remained difficult. Meanwhile, Blanco's organization continued to expand. According to investigators, she exercised strict control over operations despite rarely exposing herself unnecessarily. Trusted associates handled many day-to-day activities, while major decisions reportedly required her approval. She preferred insulation. Distance made surveillance more difficult. It also made her harder to connect directly to violent crimes. Former associates later testified that she expected complete loyalty. Disobedience was viewed not simply as a business problem, but as a personal betrayal. Several cooperating witnesses would eventually tell investigators that this culture of absolute obedience helped maintain discipline throughout her organization. At the same time, Blanco's personal life reflected the contradictions of her criminal career. She accumulated enormous wealth, luxury homes, expensive jewelry, designer fashion, high-end automobiles. Yet those closest to her described someone who remained deeply suspicious. She frequently changed residences. She distrusted outsiders. She believed rivals, informants, and law enforcement were constantly attempting to locate her. In many ways, those fears were justified. Federal investigators were beginning to connect individual cocaine seizures, financial transactions, and homicide investigations into a much larger picture. What had initially appeared to be separate criminal groups increasingly pointed toward a single organization operating across multiple states. And one name surfaced again and again: Griselda Blanco. Still, proving her responsibility was another matter entirely. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence was limited. Those willing to testify often feared for their lives. The woman who had built her empire in secrecy seemed almost untouchable, but success carried its own dangers. As Blanco's wealth and influence grew, so did the number of enemies she created. Competing traffickers wanted her territory. Former associates wanted greater control. Law enforcement devoted increasing resources to dismantling her organization. The balance that had allowed her empire to flourish was beginning to shift. Miami had made Griselda Blanco one of the most powerful cocaine traffickers in America. It would also become the city where her organization attracted the greatest scrutiny. The streets that had enriched her were growing more violent with every passing month. And soon the conflict would escalate into one of the bloodiest chapters of the American cocaine trade, an era of contract killings, motorcycle assassins, and an ever-expanding cycle of revenge that neither money nor fear could contain. By 1980, South Florida had become the front line of America's cocaine epidemic. Every week, aircraft crossed the Caribbean carrying shipments worth millions of dollars. Speedboats landed on isolated stretches of coastline under the cover of darkness. Hidden compartments in vehicles transported cocaine north to cities across the United States. The profits were almost beyond imagination, but wherever fortunes grew overnight, violence followed just as quickly. The battle for Miami's cocaine market entered a new and deadly phase. Law enforcement officers would later refer to the period simply as the Cocaine Wars. It was not a formal conflict between two organizations. It was a brutal struggle involving dozens of trafficking groups, independent smugglers, hired gunmen, and criminal alliances that shifted almost daily. Territory changed hands through intimidation. Business disputes ended with assassinations. Trust became almost impossible. At the center of many investigations was Griselda Blanco's organization. Federal agents believed her network controlled a significant portion of the cocaine entering South Florida. That dominance brought extraordinary wealth, but it also placed her directly in the path of ambitious rivals determined to take her place. Competition became ruthless. Wholesale distributors were targeted, couriers vanished, safe houses were attacked. Entire shipments disappeared after armed robberies orchestrated by competing organizations. Every successful theft threatened millions of dollars. Every betrayal demanded a response. Former investigators later described an environment where retaliation had become almost automatic. If one trafficker ordered a killing, another quickly answered. Each act of violence created another cycle of revenge. There was no room for compromise, only survival. According to court testimony and cooperating witnesses, Blanco believed that hesitation invited weakness. Those suspected of cooperating with authorities were viewed as immediate threats. Employees accused of stealing money or cocaine faced severe consequences. Rivals who challenged her authority often found themselves under constant surveillance by members of her organization. Fear became part of everyday business. Witnesses later testified that people working within Blanco's network understood the risks clearly. Loyalty was expected. Failure could be fatal. One of the defining characteristics of the cocaine wars was the increasing professionalism of contract killers. Rather than relying on impulsive acts of violence, criminal organizations began hiring specialists whose only responsibility was murder. Some conducted surveillance for days before striking. Others waited outside homes, restaurants, or offices for the perfect opportunity. Many disappeared immediately after completing their assignments. Investigators frequently arrived only minutes too late. Crime scenes became tragically familiar: bullet-riddled luxury cars, abandoned parking lots, residential streets where neighbors heard gunfire but saw little else. Victims often carried false identification, making investigations even more difficult. By the time police identified them, witnesses had disappeared and suspects had crossed state lines or international borders. Miami's homicide rate climbed dramatically. In 1980 alone, the city recorded more than 600 homicides, one of the highest totals in its history. While not every killing was connected to narcotics, authorities concluded that the cocaine trade had become a major driver of the violence, overwhelming local law enforcement. Police departments struggled to keep pace. Detectives investigated multiple homicides simultaneously, evidence rooms filled with unsolved case files. Ballistics experts compared shell casings from one crime scene to another, searching for patterns that might reveal connections between seemingly unrelated murders. The workload was unprecedented. Federal agencies responded by expanding their investigations. The Drug Enforcement Administration increased undercover operations. The FBI devoted additional resources to organized crime intelligence. The U.S. Customs Service intensified inspections at ports and airports. Financial investigators began tracing suspicious cash transactions through banks and businesses. For the first time, authorities were treating international cocaine trafficking as a coordinated national security concern rather than a series of isolated drug cases. Still, dismantling organizations like Blanco's proved extraordinarily difficult. Her network operated through layers of insulation. Suppliers rarely met distributors. Distributors rarely knew couriers. Couriers often knew only a single contact. Even if one participant agreed to cooperate, investigators gained only a small piece of the larger operation. This compartmentalized structure would later become a model for other trafficking organizations. Blanco also understood the importance of mobility. She changed residences frequently. She relied on multiple vehicles. Meetings were arranged at the last minute. Telephone conversations were kept brief or avoided altogether. In an era before digital surveillance, these precautions complicated every investigation. Yet the greatest obstacle facing prosecutors was not logistics, it was fear. Potential witnesses refused interviews. Some fled the state entirely. Others simply disappeared. Those who considered cooperating often believed they would be killed before reaching a courtroom. Whether every fear was justified mattered less than the perception itself. The reputation surrounding Blanco's organization became one of its strongest forms of protection. As investigators built homicide cases, another pattern emerged. Many victims had once been trusted associates, former partners, drivers, distributors, bodyguards. The cocaine trade rewarded loyalty generously, but it punished betrayal with equal force. Criminal alliances rarely lasted. The enormous profits available in Miami encouraged ambition. Lieutenants dreamed of becoming bosses, partners questioned accounting records, friends became competitors. No relationship was immune from suspicion. The atmosphere of paranoia extended to Blanco herself. According to multiple investigators, she became increasingly convinced that rivals were plotting against her. Security around her tightened. Access became more restricted. Only a small inner circle handled sensitive information. The woman who had once quietly expanded her organization was now living inside a fortress of distrust. Ironically, the very methods that protected her organization also isolated her from it. As more responsibilities passed to trusted subordinates, the risk of internal betrayal increased. Federal agents recognized this vulnerability. Rather than focusing solely on drug seizures, they intensified efforts to recruit informants from within trafficking organizations. Reduced prison sentences, financial incentives, witness protection. Authorities hoped someone close to Blanco would eventually decide cooperation offered a better future than loyalty. It would take time, but the strategy was beginning to work. Behind the scenes, investigators were assembling financial records, surveillance reports, telephone analyses, and witness statements into a growing body of evidence. For years, Blanco had appeared almost untouchable. Now the first cracks were beginning to show, yet even as federal agents closed in, another development was unfolding thousands of miles away in Colombia. A new generation of traffickers was consolidating power. Their names would soon become known around the world. Among them was a man whose empire would eventually eclipse nearly every other drug organization in history, Pablo Escobar. But before his name dominated the international headlines, Griselda Blanco had already demonstrated how immense fortunes and unimaginable violence could be built on cocaine. By the early 1980s, Griselda Blanco's reputation had become one of the most powerful weapons in her organization. Long before many people knew her face, they knew the stories of rivals who disappeared without warning, stories of trusted associates who were never seen again after questioning her authority, stories of deaths settled not in courtrooms but with gunfire. Some of those stories were supported by witness testimony and criminal investigations. Others grew larger with each retelling, becoming part of the mythology surrounding one of the most feared figures in the cocaine trade. For investigators, separating fact from legend became an investigation of its own. What was beyond dispute was that violence followed Blanco's organization with alarming frequency. Federal prosecutors and local detectives linked members of her network to numerous homicides carried out in both New York and South Florida. Cooperating witnesses described an organization that relied on intimidation, retaliation, and contract killings to protect its business interests. Murder was not viewed as an emotional response. It was treated as a business decision. If someone threatened the operation, they became a liability, and liabilities were removed. Former investigators would later explain that this approach distinguished Blanco from many of her contemporaries. She was not simply reacting to violence. She appeared willing to use it proactively. Potential informants, unreliable couriers, competitors expanding into her territory, individuals accused of stealing money, each represented a possible threat to the organization. Witnesses testified that even rumors of betrayal could trigger deadly consequences. Among the most enduring aspects of Blanco's criminal legacy was the widespread use of motorcycle-riding assassins. The tactic was simple. Two riders approached their target on a motorcycle. The passenger opened fire at close range. Within seconds, both disappeared into traffic before police could respond. The method was fast, highly mobile, difficult to intercept, and devastatingly effective in crowded urban environments. Over time, motorcycle assassinations became strongly associated with organized crime in Colombia. Many investigators and journalists have credited Griselda Blanco with helping popularize the tactic within cocaine trafficking circles. Others argue that similar methods had already been used by criminal groups before Blanco adopted them. The historical record does not conclusively establish who introduced the technique first. What is clear is that members of Blanco's organization repeatedly employed motorcycle gunmen during the years when her criminal enterprise operated at its peak. The strategy offered several advantages. Motorcycles could weave through congested streets where cars became trapped. They attracted less attention than heavily armed vehicles. Escape routes were easier to plan. Witnesses often struggled to identify riders wearing helmets or moving at high speed. By the time officers reached the scene, the killers had usually vanished. The tactic spread quickly. Other trafficking organizations recognized its effectiveness and adopted similar methods. In time, motorcycle assassinations became a grim hallmark of Colombia's escalating drug violence. Meanwhile, in South Florida, law enforcement officers were confronting increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. Detectives noticed that many killings appeared carefully planned. Victims were observed for days before attacks. Their routines were studied. Their vehicles were identified. Opportunities were selected with precision. The professionalism suggested experienced surveillance teams rather than impulsive acts of revenge. Former associates who later cooperated with authorities described an organization where assignments were delegated with military discipline. Drivers, lookouts, gunmen, safe house coordinators. Each performed a specific role. Many participants knew only enough information to complete their own task. This compartmentalized structure complicated homicide investigations. Even when police arrested suspected shooters, identifying the individuals who ordered the killings remained extraordinarily difficult. Blanco herself rarely appeared near crime scenes. Investigators believed she intentionally insulated herself from direct involvement, communicating through trusted intermediaries and longtime associates. This distance created significant legal challenges. Rumors surrounding her involvement circulated widely, but prosecutors needed evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. Witness testimony became crucial. Several former associates eventually described meetings in which violent retaliation was discussed. Others recounted being instructed to locate rivals, monitor their movements, or collect information about potential targets. Some testimony contributed directly to later prosecutions. Other accounts remained impossible to corroborate independently. As with much of Blanco's history, documented facts existed alongside stories that could never be fully verified. One case that drew significant attention involved the 1982 killing of a young boy named Johnny Castro. The child was the son of Jesus Chucho Castro, a former associate of Blanco who had become one of her rivals. According to prosecutors, gunmen seeking to kill Castro instead ambushed the vehicle carrying his family. The child was fatally shot. The case shocked investigators and intensified efforts to dismantle Blanco's organization. Years later, federal prosecutors would charge Blanco with conspiracy in connection with the murder. Although legal proceedings became complicated by issues involving witness credibility and prosecutorial conduct, the case remained one of the most notorious allegations associated with her criminal career. For detectives, it demonstrated how the violence surrounding the cocaine trade increasingly affected people beyond the traffickers themselves. Families became targets, children became victims, public spaces became scenes of execution, fear spread throughout entire communities. The psychological impact was enormous. Restaurant owners worried about customers caught in crossfire. Business owners installed security systems. Residents avoided certain neighborhoods after dark. Even experienced police officers acknowledged that the violence had reached levels they had never encountered before. At the same time, Blanco's personal image continued to evolve. Within criminal circles, she inspired both admiration and fear. Some viewed her as an exceptionally intelligent organizer who had built a multi-million-dollar enterprise in an overwhelmingly male criminal world. Others saw her as unpredictable and increasingly dangerous. Several former associates later claimed that distrust dominated her leadership style. She frequently suspected betrayal. She questioned the loyalty of those closest to her. Long-standing relationships could deteriorate overnight if she believed someone posed a threat. Whether every suspicion was justified became almost irrelevant. Inside the organization, perception alone carried consequences. As investigators assembled homicide files, another realization emerged. Many killings that initially appeared unrelated were connected through overlapping associates, shared telephone numbers, financial transactions, or cooperating witnesses. Piece by piece, authorities began mapping a criminal network extending across Florida, New York, California, and Colombia. The picture was becoming clearer. Griselda Blanco was not merely directing cocaine shipments. According to prosecutors, she presided over an organization where violence functioned as an integral part of business strategy. Yet, even as investigators closed in, events beyond her control were reshaping the international cocaine trade. In Colombia, powerful trafficking groups were consolidating into larger, more organized cartels. In the United States, federal agencies were coordinating investigations on an unprecedented scale. And within Blanco's own organization, loyalty, the foundation of her empire, was beginning to fracture. The reputation that had protected her for years was becoming impossible to escape. Every murder brought greater scrutiny. Every witness increased the risk. Every surviving rival represented another potential source of evidence. The empire built through fear was approaching its most dangerous moment. For Griselda Blanco, the greatest threat would no longer come from outside her organization. It would come from the people who knew it best. By the early 1980s, the global cocaine trade had entered a new era. What had once been a collection of independent smugglers and loosely connected trafficking groups was evolving into something far larger. In Colombia, powerful criminal organizations were beginning to coordinate production, transportation, security, and international distribution on an unprecedented scale. At the center of this transformation was the city of Medellin. The same streets where Griselda Blanco had spent much of her youth were now producing some of the most influential drug traffickers in modern history. Names that had once been known only to Colombian police were becoming familiar to intelligence agencies around the world. Among them was Pablo Escobar. Unlike Blanco, whose rise had begun years earlier through smuggling networks stretching into New York, Escobar built much of his early fortune inside Colombia. He expanded from local criminal enterprises into large-scale cocaine trafficking, gradually assembling partnerships with suppliers, transport specialists, financiers, and armed enforcers. By the early 1980s, he had become one of the dominant figures in what investigators would later call the Medellin Cartel. Despite the name, the Medellin Cartel was never a corporation with a single executive or rigid chain of command. It was better understood as a loose alliance. Powerful traffickers cooperated when it benefited their business. They shared laboratories, they coordinated transportation, they invested in smuggling routes, but they also competed. Profits remained personal, trust remained limited, alliances shifted constantly. Griselda Blanco occupied a unique position within this emerging landscape. She belonged to an earlier generation of traffickers. Long before Escobar's name appeared in international headlines, Blanco had already established profitable distribution networks inside the United States. She understood American markets, cultivated reliable distributors, and had years of experience moving cocaine across international borders. In many ways, she represented a bridge between the earliest cocaine smugglers and the cartel system that followed. Popular culture has often portrayed Blanco and Escobar as close partners or bitter enemies. The historical evidence is far less dramatic. There is no reliable documentation showing that the two operated as long-term business partners or maintained a sustained personal relationship. While investigators believe their criminal networks existed within the same broader trafficking environment and almost certainly intersected through suppliers and intermediaries, the extent of any direct collaboration remains unclear. What is certain is that both benefited from the explosive growth of cocaine production in Colombia. As demand in the United States soared, laboratories expanded, airstrips multiplied, smuggling routes became increasingly sophisticated. Entire regions of Colombia were transformed by the wealth flowing from the cocaine trade. The profits were staggering. A kilogram of cocaine purchased in Colombia for a relatively modest sum could be sold in the United States for many times its original value. Every successful shipment generated enormous returns. That wealth reshaped organized crime. Traffickers invested in fleets of aircraft, fishing vessels, luxury properties. Legitimate businesses used to disguise illegal income. Money moved through banks, shell companies, and international financial networks with remarkable speed. For many traffickers, violence became another business expense. Security forces were expanded. Bodyguards carried automatic weapons. Private intelligence networks monitored both rivals and law enforcement. In Colombia, armed groups protected laboratories hidden deep in remote areas. Corruption also became increasingly important. Investigators later documented efforts by trafficking organizations to influence officials through bribery: police officers, customs personnel, politicians, business figures. Not everyone accepted these offers, but the enormous amounts of money available allowed traffickers to test the integrity of institutions at every level. The Colombian government faced an unprecedented challenge. It was no longer confronting isolated criminal gangs. It was confronting organizations whose financial resources rivaled those of legitimate corporations. Meanwhile, in the United States, federal authorities were beginning to understand the scale of what they faced. The Drug Enforcement Administration expanded international cooperation with Colombian authorities. Intelligence sharing increased. Financial investigations became more sophisticated. Rather than focusing solely on drug seizures, investigators began targeting entire trafficking organizations. Money, communications, transportation, leadership. The strategy reflected a growing realization. Removing one shipment did little if the organization behind it remained intact. For Griselda Blanco, these developments created new pressures. As larger trafficking groups emerged, competition intensified. More suppliers entered the market. More distributors sought independence. More ambitious traffickers challenged established figures. The criminal world that Blanco had helped pioneer was becoming increasingly crowded. Former investigators have suggested that Blanco's management style differed from that of some cartel leaders. She emphasized personal loyalty above all else. Family members occupied important roles. Longtime associates received positions of trust. Business relationships often depended on personal allegiance rather than formal agreements. That approach had advantages. It created strong internal discipline, but it also carried serious risks. When personal relationships deteriorated, business relationships often collapsed with them. As the cocaine industry expanded, another difference became apparent. Escobar increasingly sought political influence inside Colombia, even winning election as an alternate member of the Colombian Congress in 1982 before his criminal activities led to his political downfall. Blanco pursued a different path. She remained focused on trafficking itself. Her influence came through distribution networks rather than public visibility. She preferred operating behind layers of intermediaries. Yet both traffickers demonstrated a similar understanding of power. Money alone was never enough. Influence required fear, respect, control, and absolute confidence that betrayal would not go unanswered. Throughout the early 1980s, violence in both Colombia and the United States continued to escalate. Contract killings increased, kidnappings became more common. Bombings and political intimidation would soon reshape Colombia's national security landscape. Although Blanco was never associated with the large-scale campaign of bombings that later became linked to Escobar's conflict with the Colombian state, the broader criminal environment was becoming increasingly militarized. Traffickers invested in heavier weapons, larger security teams, more sophisticated communications. The cocaine business had evolved into an international conflict involving governments, intelligence agencies, organized crime, and billions of dollars. For Blanco, the changing landscape presented a difficult reality. The methods that had once made her one of the most successful traffickers in America were no longer unique. Other organizations had adopted similar transportation systems, compartmentalized networks, professional assassins, complex money laundering operations. The criminal world she had helped shape was beginning to surpass even her own organization in size and influence. At the same time, investigators in the United States were making quiet but significant progress. Years of surveillance, financial records, telephone analyses, drug seizures, and the testimony of former associates were gradually converging into a clearer picture of Blanco's empire. Federal prosecutors believed they were finally approaching the point where suspicion could be transformed into evidence. For the first time in years, Griselda Blanco faced an adversary that could not be intimidated, bribed, or eliminated through violence: a coordinated federal investigation. The empire that had survived countless rivals, betrayals, and gang wars was about to confront its greatest challenge, not from another trafficker, but from the combined efforts of American law enforcement. For years, Blanco had relied on secrecy, intimidation, and absolute loyalty. Now those same foundations were beginning to crack. The empire that had once seemed untouchable was showing its first real signs of collapse. Watch out for Part 2, The Hunt for Griselda Blanco. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified facts, court records, and official investigations. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the most unsettling mysteries are often the ones hidden in plain sight.